Hey everyone, Eric here. Just before we get to today's show, I want to let you know that we're offering our podcast listeners a special 20% lifetime discount to the China-Africa Daily Brief. Now, that's the newsletter that Cobus and I produce every day that provides the most comprehensive digest of everything China's doing on the continent and now increasingly throughout the global south. In addition to the newsletter, you'll also get full archive access to the website and the China-Africa Experts Network as well. To get that discount, just go to chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe and use the promo code podcast at checkout. Once again, that's chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa-China relations through reporting grants, workshops, and other opportunities for journalists. More information at africachinareporting.co.za and our dedicated training website at africachinatraining.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we are about 6, 7, maybe 8 months away from the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The reason why I'm a little bit vague as to when it is, because nobody really knows until about a month before oftentimes, and they just announce the date. But we know it's going to happen sometime this fall or maybe early winter in Dakar, Senegal. And that means right now, across the continent, negotiating teams are supposedly, one presumably assumes that they are getting ready their plans on what they want to do and how they want to negotiate with the Chinese and what they want to submit for their contribution to the FOCAC process. And this made me think about what's been going on over the past couple of years in the conversations, Cobus, you and I have been having with various stakeholders. I've had a number with diplomats in Beijing. We had Rashid Griffith from the excellent China in the Caribbean podcast on a couple of weeks ago. And some of our guests who we've talked about in South America all say the same thing, that when it comes to negotiating with the Chinese, oftentimes there's a giant imbalance, an asymmetry, if you will. And what it is the fact that oftentimes the human capital and the understanding of China on the BRI or the country in the global south is really lacking and oftentimes not present at all. As Rashid Griffith told us in our Caribbean podcast, literally, he said, there is no negotiating strategy. There is no China strategy. There's no team of people who have a background in Chinese culture, language, history, politics to be able to articulate what it is they want from the Chinese in the negotiations so they can get a better deal out of even just the infrastructure arrangements, trade, you name it. This is a problem. But it's interesting because just last week, an article was published on the Natural Resources Governance Institute website. It was written by Hervé Ladeau, who is the Guinea country manager for NRGI, and also Folashade Soule, who is the senior research associate at the University of Oxford. Both are leading experts in the field of African negotiations with Chinese stakeholders. We've had both on our program over the years to talk about this issue. They convened a workshop last year in Benin, and they brought together stakeholders from various African countries to kind of workshop out what they could do to improve African agency and negotiating strategies with the Chinese. And from this, they came out with 3 recommendations that I hope will inform our discussion today. Number 1, build informed and comprehensive negotiation teams. This was recommendation number 1. The common pitfall, they write, for African governments is that they're disregarding interministerial coordination and ending up in a ratio of 1 African to 3 Chinese negotiations. So this is very interesting. So what they'll say is their recommendation is form within the government a China unit with Chinese-speaking negotiators aware of Chinese cultural specificities. So build up the China knowledge. This is something that you and I have talked about, and that's what's clearly lacking in a number of countries. Recommendation number 2, trust national standards and address common information asymmetries. This information asymmetry goes to how are they being informed ahead of the negotiations, and really kind of coordinating and also not deferring to Chinese standards for everything. So sometimes you want to make sure that your standards in your countries and really stick to that. And that's very, very interesting, the point that they brought up. The final point that they brought up involve legal and financial expertise where required. So they write, external expertise can be useful in areas where the African side is lacking capacity. Terms should be exposed to citizens and national oversight entities' scrutiny to ensure accountability. So that transparency also helps a lot. And this is something we haven't seen that much, not only in Africa, but also in South America, the Persian Gulf, and other global South countries, where transparency remains a big issue. They recommend that by putting the contracts out, sunshine is a wonderful disinfectant, and we hope that we see more of that. So the work that Hervé and Folashade are doing is so important because it really helps to even the game between the Chinese and these smaller countries. And so it's great that they're having these workshops. But Cobus, one other area of information asymmetry is, well, what you do. Think tanks. I mean, we've spoken with a number of stakeholders in lesser developed countries over the years who say that they depend largely on US and European think tanks and information, say from the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins or at the Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, but they don't have it domestically. And so their China positions are oftentimes informed by what's going on in the US and Europe.
Yes, this is an important and complicated issue. One, I think one should make a distinction between between think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, for example, who feeds directly into knowledge production for the U.S. government, and then institutions like the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins, which just researches a bunch of data and makes it public. So their databases, their loan databases, for example, isn't particularly shaped in any direction. It isn't serving a particular audience. It's setting up as comprehensive loan data as they can get, and kind of making it generally kind of available to everyone. So in theory, that kind of resource would be able to be very useful for a kind of a think tank in a global South country. The problem frequently is getting the people with the training, and then also kind of just keeping that think tank running. Because even for global North think tanks, the funding landscape at the moment is very constrained. So that's particularly difficult for Southern think tanks.
Well, we wanted to find somebody who actually is working in one of these smaller countries and does negotiations with the Chinese, who's actually living out what Hervé and Folashade are recommending in terms of building the China competency and trying to break down some of the walls. And we went back into our database and we found our old friend Santiago Bustelo, who is now back in Argentina. We first interviewed him on the program when he was a graduate student in Shanghai at Fudan University, where he is on the verge, very, very close to receiving his doctoral degree in international politics. So we're hoping that that goes through this year. But he's now a China advisor in Argentina's Ministry of Development. And before that, he was a research coordinator at the China-Brazil Business Council. Santiago, a very good morning to you in Buenos Aires, and welcome back to the program.
Good morning or good night, Eric and Cabas. It's really nice to be back here with you and discuss these China issues.
It's wonderful to have you back on the show, and especially now in your new position as a China advisor for the Argentinian government. Before we get into the details of what you're doing and this idea of narrowing the information asymmetries and improving the Argentina's negotiating position with China, why don't we start with just a little bit of a broader overview of where we are today in Argentina, China relations, and Latin America China relations, particularly in this era of the pandemic. So let's just kind of do a little introduction, simply because our audience doesn't necessarily follow LATAM as closely as, say, Africa does. So why don't we just start with, where are we today in the China-LATAM relationship?
Well, sure. I mean, the basic storyline is that since the 2000s, obviously, the importance of China, firstly, in economic terms, grew up consistently, mainly in that moment, driven by the so-called commodity boom. And it was a period of high growth of the Chinese economy, but also of high growth in Latin American countries in general, due to this international environment. This also was accompanied in many South American countries by progressive or center-left governments that pursued some redistribution policies and social policies. So it was a moment where the Chinese high growth and demand for commodities had a big impact on Latin American economic performance. Of course, over the years, the relationship, which was mainly focused on trade, growth and gained more complexity, starting to diversify to investments from Chinese enterprise, yes, and furthermore, and more recently, financing. And of course, also by new initiatives in the political or diplomatic sphere. So undoubtedly, in the last, I would say, 15 years, China has become a structural force in Latin American economies, in the sense that it's an unavoidable economic partner. It has become the major trade partner of, I would say, the majority of Latin American countries. It has become a very important source of financing for many Latin American countries, also for investment. And of course, it started to diversify to other initiatives in the diplomatic sphere. So I would say that it's pretty clear that the relationship has growth and diversified in all the important spheres.
And as this relationship grew and diversified, did these countries also see the growth of China competency among diplomats and among other kind of trade negotiators and other government officials?
I mean, yes, I do believe that. I mean, our countries, Latin American countries, were not and still are not particularly prepared for the so quick rise of such a big, important, and different country. Yes, of course, in Latin America, we come from I would say, Western tradition in terms of ideas, culture, and this type of things. So the rise of China, in that sense, of course, generated new complexities that I do believe that the local bureaucracies have difficulty to deal with, still have.
Let's dive into Argentina and what you're doing in Buenos Aires, and tell us a little bit about the China-Argentina relationship, because in many ways it does seem similar to an Africa-China relation in that it's a commodities-based exporting country. Again, huge size imbalance that's there. Talk to us a little bit about Argentina's relationship with China.
Of course, yes. Well, Argentina's relationship with China in general follows the pattern I just mentioned. So we are, and you're right, we are mainly commodity exporters. We export basically soybeans. That's the major part of our exports to China. Meat, some oil, and then other related, I would say, other agricultural and mineral related products. Yes. That's, I would say, the pillar of the relationship. Today, China is the second trade partner of Argentina after Brazil, but it's in the last years becoming also the first in some months of the trade relationship. Argentina, particularly, is a country that has domestically several economic and political problems. So that also has, I would say, has kind of not released the whole potential the relationship has compared to other countries of the region, like Brazil or Chile, which have basically more trade than Argentina, have also use better the opportunities of the Chinese market. So Argentina, I would say that in general is a little bit behind grasping the opportunities of China. But it's true that the relationship has consolidated, and of course the financing has been very important. China is financing several structural infrastructure works like railways, hydroelectric dams, solar parks. So in that sense, it has become a very important financing source for these infrastructure projects in a country as Argentina that has, I would say, historical problem in accessing foreign reserves. It has cyclically some kind of debt crisis that indeed we're going through right now. So in that point, China has and doubly became a very important source of financing. Due to the macroeconomic stability in Argentina and other factors, we are still not receiving too much Chinese investment compared to other countries, for example, Brazil. This, I would say that it's one of the major challenges Argentina is facing in its relationship to China, which is to attract more investment and to stop doing everything through financing and start to, receive some genuine greenfield or joint venture investment from China. And of course, as I was saying, this has been followed by the consolidation of diplomatic relationship. We have now the strategic comprehensive partnership status with China. We are still not signed the MOU for the Belt and Road Initiative, but I do believe that this is not going to take too long to become a reality. So in general, what we have seen is it's a more complexity in the ties economic, but still because I would say Argentina's domestic deficiencies in terms of macroeconomic stability, maybe political instability, we are still not, I would say, grasping the whole potential of having China as a strategic or as a fundamental economic partner.
What level of peer learning do you see between officials from different Latin American countries? Is there a movement to try and kind of work together across borders to how, particularly to maximize complementarities in relation to Chinese financing, for example? That's one of the things that's coming up in Africa now, because there's a lot of talk about hooking the African continental free trade area to the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's more discussion, or I think there will be more discussion about how countries can work together to try and kind of maximize cross-border complementarities, while saving themselves money. So I was wondering if there is any kind of peer learning happening across the border in between different Latin American countries.
Well, honestly, I don't see that exactly. And I think that one of the important or big differences in the case of Africa and Latin America is that Africa has managed to build a more institutionalized relationship through FOCAC with China, where I can see that there is, I would not say perfect, but more coordination between countries in the negotiation with China. So Latin America has a kind of forum which is called CELAC China Forum, which will be like the equivalent of FOCAC, but it has not gained too much importance. It exists, but it has really no coordinating power, and more at a more reduced level between, for example, Argentina and neighbor countries. I also do not see any kind of coordination or common strategy or whatsoever. And this is also particularly not a very good moment for Latin America to do that, because the political forces that govern the countries, at least in South America, are very dissimilar in their political orientations. So this also makes more complex to coordinate and have a common strategy. It's also important to say that in the times, for example, when we would say in the 2000s, where there were many center-left governments governing the region, and there was more regional integration and coordination. Still, in the case of China, we didn't saw some kind of common approach or talks to have some kind of coordination in this issue. So I do believe that in the case of Latin America, there is I would say almost no coordination at all.
Well, that's interesting, because a lot of people don't realize that China does a third more trade with Latin America. And when we say Latin America, South America, than it does with Africa. The Chinese Foreign Ministry just last week announced that for the third year running, and even with the pandemic, the Chinese did $300 billion of trade with Latin South America compared to $187 billion with Africa last year. So strong trade numbers. And it's interesting that you would think that huge volume of trade would bring people together to share knowledge and whatnot. But again, it seems like, just as Cobus kind of pointed out, there isn't a lot of knowledge sharing. There isn't a lot of coordination. And I'm wondering, do you think that sets the region back? And does that set Argentina back, that there isn't more knowledge sharing? Or is there another kind of scenario that I'd like to get your feedback on, is there's not much knowledge to share because there aren't a lot of people like you who have such a deep China background who are actually in government positions to do that kind of sharing?
I do believe it's a little bit both, you mentioned. First of all, my impression is that this kind of forums, in the case of Latin America, which is the CELAC and China Forum, it's more an initiative from the Chinese side that truly from the Latin American saying, we should get together in order to have a stronger position to negotiate with China. So paradoxically, I do believe that it's China has been more interested in pushing forward this kind of initiatives, regional forums to sit all the Latin American countries together. So that point, I think it's interesting to have in mind. And then I do believe that, of course, there is a lack of professionals really specialized in China. I would say this is a common variable, although improving, but it's still a common variable in the majority of Latin American countries, yes. And also I do believe that, it's not only in the case of China. Latin America had or still has considerable difficulties in articulating some kind of regional economic project. So you have different initiatives that superpose. You have Mercosur, you have the Pacific Alliance, the Mexico is more, of course, integrated to the NAFTA. So it's very difficult beyond China, I would say, for Latin American countries to have some kind of coordination or regional integration. Yes, and initiatives usually go forward a couple of years, but then there is a change in the political government in some countries, and it goes back, and I would say that that's a major barrier for having a common approach in general, and also in the case of China.
So now that you're working, as a China expert in the ministry, what are some of the misperceptions among your colleagues that you have to correct, and what are some of the kind of ideas about China that you see among colleagues in the ministry? Well,
it's difficult to say. One of the things I believe we can see it's pretty common. It's the idea that, of course, there's a lack of knowledge, but the idea that China will come and give us a lot of money or a lot of investment, and it will, transform the country automatically. And indeed, when you start to work on projects and negotiate and these things, it's all much more complex. Yes, and it takes more time. And I do believe that China also, on the other side, is getting a little bit more, cautious about what to finance, where to invest, and that makes that, you have to be very clear on which are your strategic projects, what are the characteristics of the technical questions and the technical problems. And I do believe that it's important to have a very clear, defined project to go to negotiate with China. I would say that this is a common misconception. And also at the society level, I do believe that China still has some kind of negative image in many parts of society. The media and the Western media, of course, plays a very fundamental role. And this also hinders some kind of possibility to go forward with some projects that I do believe generate some kind of rejection or opposition. I would say not because of they're from China, but it also doesn't help. So this misconception at the society level is also a big problem, I do believe.
It's interesting you talk about how there's a perception that China is a big bag of money that you can just kind of go in and grab some money to get out of. The Boston University team who at the Global Policy Development Center has some fascinating data on energy financing, which 4 or 5 years ago was at $36 billion a year, and last year fell to zero. Literally zero, nothing. I mean, so that money pipeline is constricted now, and it's not coming in anywhere near as much at all. And private investment is still probably coming, certainly in the commodities trade, but that public financing coming out of the policy banks is definitely drying up. So it makes me wonder, Why does a country like Argentina want to be a member of the Belt and Road Initiative? What are some of the objectives of becoming part of the BRI?
This, I would say, of course, my vision about the question. I do believe that the rise of China, it's really transforming the logic of the global economy, the dynamic center of the global capitalism is translating to, I would say, not only China, but also the South Asian region. I do believe that there are structural trends that are signaling that indeed, the logic of the global economy is changing, and Latin American countries should at least rethink or reorient their development strategies to these changes. And of course, I do believe that, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a lot of written about it. There's a lot of things said about it. Maybe we many times believe it was a very, very big project. Then, of course, you guys know more than me. It has their fallacies, flaws, and contradictions. But I do believe that it's an important proposal that is shaping China's vision about globalizations. And considering the global trends, I do believe that Latin American countries should start to, I wouldn't say pivot, but just to reorient some kind of strategies to start to integrate to this part of the world. So I do believe that there are structural reasons for Latin American countries to join BRI. And of course, then you would say, well, there should be some kind of negotiation process, which is, okay, I will join BRI, what I will get. And that's where things get trickier and more interesting, and where we're talking about this negotiation, where you have to have a clear strategy, a vision, and so also, I would say, more basically, some kind of clarity of what do you want in terms of domestic development and how to align these objectives with the possibilities that China is offering in this case. So I would say that there are important reasons to join, but of course this must be done with some kind of strategy and also capability to negotiate with the Chinese side.
One of the big trends in Africa's relationship with China is I think a lot of African policymakers is trying to push the relationship towards more agricultural trade, and particularly there's a lot of talk about Africa as a possible future kind of mass agriculture and particularly agro-processing powerhouse. I think Latin America and South America kind of is that powerhouse at the moment. Brazil, for example, the massive producer of agricultural commodities. What are some of the things or some of the lessons that Africa should learn from South America in this kind of development? And then what are some of the pitfalls from South America that they should try and avoid?
Well, I do believe that all the agricultural, agribusiness sector is really it has an important potential. I would say that in order to maximize, the exports or this the potential of the sector with China, I would just work from the beginning, kind of articulating some kind of, all the supply chain of the agricultural product in order to, from the beginning, try to add value and not just export the soybeans or the iron ore or whatsoever, and try to. I'm not asking for just very complex things, but just start to add a little bit of value where it's possible, and in that sense gain some more revenue, basically. So there's a big potential. The Chinese market, I do believe it will continue to demand many commodities for its growth, the increasing domestic market, the raising purchasing power of the population. There's an opportunity, but I do believe that it has to be worked at the domestic level, basically trying to maximize the supply chains and the value added of these products, and also in where it's possible also to give priority to local enterprise, to build some kind of national champions in some sectors, agricultural sectors, in order that this trade, of course, can be done with a Chinese enterprise or joint venture, but to have some kind of national enterprises also participating from this.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at the Wits University Journalism Department in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za.
Let's turn our attention to politics now. I mean, you alluded in one of your earlier points that the growth of the Chinese economy represents a shift in the global trading order. That's of paramount concern today in places like Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris, who feel that the Chinese want to restructure the global trading order in its favor at the expense of the US and European-led order. What's the view from where you are in terms of China's role in the global arena and also the concerns expressed by the United States in particular?
I would say it again. I do believe that, the rise of China, or how you want to call it, it's indeed a fundamental change in the logic, not only of trade, but of global capitalism. Yes, I do believe that this is all, unless something really unexpected happens, which is totally possible, I do believe this is a structural trend that, it goes probably beyond what countries can do in some kind of way. I do believe that there's also not kind of such a plan strategy to change the global order and that kind of things. I do believe that China is still concentrating their efforts in its domestic development. They still have so many imbalances, problems. They're dealing with them pretty good. And of course, while they do this, they improve their integration to the global economy. They win some kind of maneuver margins to operate in the international sphere. I'm not saying there is no strategy, but I don't think there is some kind of well-planned strategy from Beijing in order to transform the global system and trade to replace the hegemony of the West. I don't think it works. Not only in the case of China.
So when you hear the Americans really hysterical, there's no other way to describe it when coming out of Capitol Hill and what the Secretary of State is saying and whatnot, you're disregarding a lot of that, saying, okay, it's just this is going to happen. It's a structural adjustment, but it doesn't cause the same level of concern to you in Argentina as it, say, does in Washington.
Well, I do believe that there's fundamental misconceptions in how the U.S. is seeing its place in the world, and particularly with China. So I do believe that there is a problem there, which is not only, I'm not an expert, and this is just my opinion, but I do believe that there is some kind of limitation, not only from the political leaders regarding the place of the U.S. in the international system, but also from American society. So it's very difficult, to have a pragmatic strategy when you still have, this kind of preconceived visions. But I do believe, yes, that this idea of contain China or doing an alliance with countries to contain China, I do believe it responds to some kind of anachronic vision of the international system. And I'm not saying it's going to fail, I don't know, but I do believe it's not particularly useful, or I personally don't think it will be particularly effective to counter what I think is a structural trend.
One of the spaces in which all of these tensions are playing out at the moment is in COVID-19 mitigation and vaccine diplomacy. And we've seen in Africa, like tons and tons of vaccines being delivered from China, like very big gestures, in the name of South solidarity, and then like very like strong contrast being drawn between the way that China is acting in relation to COVID and how the US and Europe is acting. How is that shaking out, on your side of the Atlantic? How does it look in Latin America?
Absolutely the same. It's incredible, Carlos, and it's really surprising. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, and several Latin American countries, they're just receiving the Chinese and Russian vaccines, yes, which is fundamental. There's a pandemic, which is affecting, of course, the health and lives of people, also the economy. So I wouldn't be able to stress enough how important it is for a country to get the vaccines in order to solve as quick as possible this problem, yes? And of course, we know that the international level is not easy to get vaccines because, of course, you have to ramp up the production very quickly. There's not enough vaccines in these moments for everyone. And I haven't seen from the US leaders, from European leaders, of course, we're not receiving vaccines. We have I mean, not even selling. I mean, I don't see here the Pfizer or Moderna. We had a deal with the AstraZeneca, but it's not going forward. So I don't see, but let's take the facts aside. I don't see even at the rhetorical level some kind of leader from the US or Europe saying, well, we are very compromised with the developing countries to get the vaccines. We think this is very fair. We should work. And then maybe, I mean, they do nothing, but at least just to say it. So it's impressive. I mean, and this is not only in the case of the vaccines. From the beginning of the pandemic, China was sending sanitary supply, health supply. Then you can discuss it was enough. It was just not very big supplies, but it was doing something. And developed countries, I say that they totally miss and are still missing the opportunity. And this is also part of the misconception I was mentioning about how I do believe the U.S. is seeing its international policy or whatsoever.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up this point because the U.S. has actually been very, very clear. It's not that they haven't said anything. They've been very clear. Joe Biden last week told Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador when he was in Washington, no, we're not giving you any vaccines. Not one vaccine is going to leave the United States for any other country. Instead, what they've done is they've donated $4 billion to COVAX, the Global Vaccine Alliance. $2 billion will be used right now. Another $1 billion will be used in 2 years, and a fourth $1 billion will be used in year 3. So that's spread out over 3 years. Not a very powerful message coming from the United States. But interestingly, just a funny piece of news. So President Obrador went to Washington, had his talks with Biden, or I think they did it virtually. Excuse me, they did it virtually. And then he turned right around and ordered 22 million doses from China. And what is so weird here is that I've got my clock now counting down until when the United States will criticize China intervening into the Western Hemisphere, because the United States still has a sense of the Monroe Doctrine mindset that it feels very uncomfortable when China's in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and in South America. There is this weird paternalism and sense, and it's historically rooted. But here, on the one hand, they turn away the Mexican government on vaccines, and then the Mexicans will turn to the Chinese, and the Americans will get kind of upset about that. So that is just a little side note there, but it's very interesting how direct the Americans are on that. Getting close to our time, because I know it's the beginning of your workday, so I do want to get a question in about Australia. There is a really remarkable thing happening in Australia right now, where the Australians took on very strong positions against the Chinese on the COVID origin story, on Huawei, in the South China Sea. These are core interests of the Chinese. And in response, the Chinese have mounted an all-out effort to cut off Australia. So now all of a sudden, this month, there's going to be no Australian coal imports landing in any Chinese port. They've put sanctions on wine. They've cut off the student flow. They're talking about shifting this massive iron ore business out of Australia. This has actually been a big beneficiary to countries like Argentina and Brazil and South Africa, because some of what they were sourcing from Australia, dairy and other commodities, is now being sourced elsewhere. But it really shows that if a smaller country crosses China in such a way that China is really displeased, and there's a long list of these countries now. We can just very quickly, let's talk about Australia, Sweden, Britain now is on that list because of CGTN, and then also Canada is on that list because of Huawei, and Meng Wanzhou and all the things that are going on there. From your point of view, you are in that vulnerable position that if Argentina takes a position that runs counter to a Chinese core interest, this is one of those sensitive core interests, such as Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, the South China Sea, Hong Kong, Huawei, COVID, or something like that. There's a big price to be paid. Does that factor into your thinking? And do you see what's happening in Australia and go, you know what, we don't want to go there, so we're going to stay away from politics and we're going to accommodate China? Or people don't really pay attention to that kind of stuff, and politics is just really not as much part of it?
I mean, because of of the place that I would say irrelevant between Mark's place of Latin America in international sphere, I would say, and diplomacy. We are not too much concerned about that. We are not messing in those kind of questions about. I would say you mentioned it, and I do believe that. Also, China, in the case of Latin America, I would say it's being very, very comprehensive. I can mention Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro has done so many things. I have not the list of things that he said could anger China from.
It's incredible. He's like he's comparable to Trump in how aggressive he's been towards the Chinese.
Absolutely. And China has not taken any specific measure. On the contrary, the trade is growing, and the economic relationship is going on. So I don't see that in the case of Latin America. In a region that, in that case, that we have to worry about these kind of positions. We have also to worry about not angering the United States of getting too close to China. So in this kind of I would say competition scenario in the global economy, I do believe that Latin American countries have to try to maintain a way in the best way possible in order to just focus on their own interests, national interests and strategies, and try to stay away from all this kind of political, international politics questions. That's my vision about it. But I don't see any kind of retaliation from the Chinese side. I don't see that this is only in the case it exists. It's not only some kind of China's strategies. It has been historically a common practice in the international systems. And in the case of China, at least in some cases in Latin America, I do believe that they have been more comprehensive, more understanding, that more patient that we might expect.
Coming back to your work in the ministry, as Eric's mentioned, there's a lot of pressure on African governments to try and ratchet up their China capability and to get more China experts who actually work for these governments. As someone in a comparable position in the ministry where you work, how would you advise them to go about it? Like which kinds of people do they need on their team?
Well, you start the show talking about this article about, I don't remember the name of the author.
It's Hervé Lado and Folashade Sole.
Yes, so I haven't read, but I heard what you say, and I do believe that it's a pretty good diagnosis. One of the things is, for example, he mentions as a recommendation is this of having a China unit in the government for interministerial coordination. I do believe this would be a major improvement and step, because of course, imagine it's already difficult to have a clear strategy, and if you negotiate like separated ministries every issue, you have very uncoordinated and uneven results. So I do believe that it's a very good advice, this idea of having just a coordination unit for China relationship that brings together the different initiatives from each ministry. I do believe that this is a very important question. Of course, yes, you should have there some specialists on China, which also have to work very close with the technical or other bureaucrats that have more technical knowledge about some specific questions, which are they might not know about China, but they have some kind of technical knowledge about specific projects. So you have to match these two profiles of the things. So you need some people who understand how China works, how China negotiates, or what the Belt and Road Initiative is, and you have to couple this with very strong bureaucratic capabilities in terms of technical knowledge that goes beyond China. I would say that this is important. And also the article mentioned about this dependence on Western think tanks, which also I think it's good, because I honestly think that the US and European think tanks provide very useful and high-level information. That's out of question. I do use them for get my data and read and these things. I do believe that this is also more a China task. I do believe that China still has to improve its capability to build knowledge, information about its presence in the world, its presence in Latin American countries, to explain better to societies what they're doing, why it's important, why it's beneficial, what are the problems also. But I do believe that this is a very important asymmetry that China still has to focus on.
Yeah, it's interesting because that knowledge sharing, not only as the article pointed out, within a government, but even regionally, but also internationally. There is so much that's happening in Africa, in the Gulf, in South America, in the Caribbean that I think people could benefit from just exchanging experiences on. And to be honest with you, I'm kind of surprised there isn't a conference of some kind to bring people like you together with other people, the guy in the UAE and the woman who's in Jordan and the China advisor for DIRCO in South Africa, to get together even virtually or in real life to talk and share notes. And at the end of the day, I think that China benefits enormously in their negotiations by virtue of the fact that people don't talk to each other and compare and contrast what their experiences are. So I'm happy we've had the chance to be able to share some of the experiences in Argentina with folks who are focusing on Africa and the Middle East, and and vice versa. And I'm hoping that people in your neighborhood will also maybe even kind of follow what's happening in Africa, because I think there are some really important lessons to learn. Santiago, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Santiago Bustelo is a China advisor in Argentina's Ministry of Development, and he joins us from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Santiago, you're quite active on Twitter these days. What's the best way for people to find you on Twitter and to read what you're reading and writing?
Well, as you mentioned, probably in Twitter, I just share some articles I find interesting and some opinions. My Twitter is Dr. Tabor, which is just a nickname. You can find me there, and that's it. Normally, I just write or give some interviews randomly in some kind of media or blogs. That I will share it on the Twitter, and basically, if somebody wants to know something else about it, they can just send me a message through there. I will be glad to answer.
Fantastic. We'll put a link to your Twitter in our show notes, and then hopefully the next time we speak with you very shortly, you will be, in fact, a doctor. We wish you the best of luck with your defending your dissertation at Fudan University. So we'll send you lots of good vibes for that. And again, thank you for taking the time to join us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both, for inviting me.
Because all throughout the conversation with Santiago, my head was spinning because I was thinking back to our conversation last week with former Assistant Secretary of State Tibor Nagy, and the difference in tone between what somebody from the vantage point of Argentina, and again, it's very important, Santiago doesn't speak on behalf of his government, he's speaking in his personal capacity, the sky isn't falling because China is changing the global order. And at the same time, what we've heard out of the US and Europe is radically different. And I think it speaks to the difference, the radical difference in the global South and their perception of China and the global North and its perception of Beijing. It is so stark. And we've seen this over and over across Africa, where one African government after another just says very clearly, the fights over Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea, COVID origin, Huawei, these aren't our fights. These may be your fights, but they're not our fights. And we want to have nothing to do with it. And Santiago spoke to that, where the relationship for him and the Argentinians and Brazilians and others is economic and development. That's it. They're not really interested in picking the same kind of fight of what Australia is doing right now. So I didn't get the sense that he was worried that they were going to cross one of these magical red lines and piss off the Chinese to the point where the Chinese take retribution simply because they don't care about the red line. And it's just such a different way of looking at this situation.
This is exactly why, I think concerns about the rise of China in the global North, and particularly the way that it's frequently couched in terms of China is exporting authoritarianism. I think that talking point is not very effective, because I think it's the same for South American governments and African governments. They're like, you know what? in the first place, we don't share a border with China, so we're not Vietnam, and also China makes the red lines pretty clear. So, it's pretty easy to avoid those red lines if you want to, and they all want to, So this is this kind of thing of like, it's actually okay. Like, at the moment, China might be scary later, but at the moment they're not so scary because they can, you can control the relationship to a certain extent by avoiding certain issues. And I think for that's what's not, I think, being communicated very clearly in the global north.
I want to get your take in a little bit more detail on a column you wrote last week for the newsletter that went out to our subscribers. And you said Africa's position in the world isn't an accident of inattention. And this could apply to other parts of the global south. It's structurally determined in a way that feeds into a global economic system, one that until now happens to have been built around Western dominance. And so to pick up on what you're saying is that the concern in the global north is not necessarily that it's China, which they're clearly concerned about, but it's because their hegemony is at stake now. Their power is at stake. And that's why in the global south, in countries like Argentina and South Africa, they're just not picking these fights because at the end of the day, their power isn't at stake. There's no hegemony to be lost.
Yes, that's the one thing. The other part of that same issue is that Western hegemony, of course, looks pretty nice for Western people, because it reflects their values, and at the best, at its best moments, it helped them to impart the best of their values to other parts of the world. But it's still, that hegemony is still grows out of a certain kind of historical reality, and that reality is colonialism. And before that, slavery. So Western hegemony looks very different from the global south than it does from the global north. Kind of at the moment, I think a lot of that dark history, obviously, many people don't dredge it up because the current version of that hegemony has been the edges has been sanded off them to a certain extent. But they still do come from a certain history, and so the moment you start digging into it deeper, and particularly when you start looking at kind of structural exclusion of these countries from certain kind of global governance systems, then the line coming from China that this that this system is inherently unfair, that it's biased against the global south, and that it needs reform, you're always going to get a sympathetic audience from that, because that is also the reality for many other global south countries.
And this might also explain why the United States, for example, has had really a terrible track record in signing up countries for, remember the Blue Dot Network or the Clean Network or the campaign against Huawei? Because when they go knocking on the doors in Buenos Aires and say, won't you join us in our effort to contain Chinese malign influence? They go, yeah, no, that's not for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and that's going to be difficult to form any kind of coalition beyond the white world, because right now the coalition against China, with the exception of Japan, and okay, that's actually not fair, because the Quad is now a real legitimate coalition, and the Quad is India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. So, but when we look at the United Nations, for example, on these letters that the United States has been kind of issuing to condemn Chinese human rights in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, it's traditionally been North American and European countries that are signing up to these letters, and developing countries have said, you know what, we don't want any part of it. The Quad is a different game now here in Southeast Asia and in Asia, so that does change it. It's not entirely a white thing per se. And the reason I bring up the question of white is because you made a very interesting point in a discussion that we had earlier, where I said I am ambivalent about the idea of using the term West, because the West was this concept of the United States and Europe bound by shared interests, shared values, and an aligned worldview. That's no longer the case. But you said something very interesting. You said what unites the West, so to speak, including New Zealand, Australia, is their whiteness. Talk a little bit more about that.
I'm coming to this from a South African's perspective, of course, but it does strike me that it's interesting that we're having a moment where the discussions about the global rise of China is coinciding with all of these discussions within these countries about identity and about race, and about structural exclusion because of race, I don't think that's an accident, and it's also not an accident that both of those things are coinciding with the widespread rise of right-wing nationalism across Europe, in North America, and to a certain extent also I think in Australia. So I think all of these things are happening at the same time, and it's interesting for me that they are, and I think this is kind of struggle with white supremacy, and because white supremacy obviously was one of the key pillars of the European colonial project. And so I think a lot of us are still kind of dealing with the fallout of that historical reality, and the rise of China as a non-Western superpower, kind of throws all of those issues into high relief, and in the process also throws the relationship between Africa and the West into high relief, and I think that's kind of where I'm coming from, when I'm talking in that way. But at the same time, one also has to then take into account, obviously, a lot of kind of complicating factors. One being the very high level of diversity, of racial and ethnic diversity in these kind of Western countries, and to the complicated kind of role that race plays there, not representing not only these kind of historical constructs of white supremacy, but also the kind of representing one of the most kind of compelling views of what multiculturalism might look like. So it's a really complicated thing. But I think one can't get away from the role of race, and particularly the role of whiteness in the way that the West thinks of itself.
Yeah, it's such an interesting discussion, and I'm really fascinated by that take on it, that I looked at the West in geopolitical terms, that is, shared realpolitik interests, and you're looking at it in far more cultural, racial identity terms, which is something I didn't consider. So I really find that very interesting. This idea that Santiago brought up of learning from different regions, and not only within a continent but across a continent, is something that we're doing in the newsletter. We've broadened out our focus on the China-Africa project quite a bit over the past 6 months, 7 months, in part because we recognize that if you just look at what the Chinese are doing in Africa, you're missing a big part of the story, because the Chinese don't see their activities in Africa in isolation. They see it as part of a much bigger agenda. That is what the Belt and Road is, but also there is just a bigger movement and play here. And what we see is, look at the vaccine distribution. And this is one of the things we're tracking in the newsletter every day. How they're distributing, who's getting them, how many are going to each country, are they friendly countries, are they not friendly countries, and the discourse that's happening along with it. Loans, trade, all of this is happening at a global level in the global South. It's been accentuated in many ways by the tensions with the United States and Europe. Whereas a couple of years ago, before this all blew up in the United States between the US and China, the Chinese probably would have been devoting a lot more attention to their engagement with the United States. But because those doors are closing now, they are turning that attention into the global South. And so that's what we're doing with our newsletter every day. So if you're not 100% interested in Africa, you are definitely still going to want to find out what's going on in other parts of the world. And we hope that you'll join our reader community. We keep the subscription price exceptionally low for the express reason that we want to make it accessible. It's just $7 a month for students and teachers, and $15 a month for everybody else. And we feel passionately about making information accessible to everybody. This is a passion project of Cobus and I to do this, and we really believe that information needs to be available. We do charge a little bit because it's how I make my living. To do this, Cobus has a day job. I don't, and so we do have to charge a little bit of money for it, but we do hope that you will consider subscribing. Go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Use the promo code email, and we'll give you 20% off of a lifetime subscription. So that is 20% off an annual subscription. Just go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Use the promo code email. So that'll do it for this edition of the podcast. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach me at eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com. That's ERIC. And you can find Cobus at COBUS@ChinaAfricaProject.com. We love to hear from you. Good, bad, and ugly. Please feel free to send us a note and tell us what you think. So that'll do it. We'll be back again next week with another episode. Until then, for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/ChinaAfricaProject to share your thoughts on today's show. Or follow the guys on Twitter. Eric's at Eolanda, and you can find Cobus at Stadenesque. For more information about the China-Africa Project and to sign up for our free weekly email news brief, go to ChinaAfricaProject.com.